If you want to make fewer mistakes when you're playing in Magic Arena, you might want to read the card very carefully to make sure you know exactly how it works. Here I have quite a few different examples of cards that trigger very slightly differently, and if you don't read the card properly, you're going to be making mistakes. Before we get started, don't forget you can like this video if you find it helpful, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future content like this. Let's get on with going through some of these rules. So it's really important that you read the card carefully because it will tell you exactly how it works, and if you don't read a card carefully, you're going to be making mistakes. So some differences you might find are: with Soul Warden, this triggers whenever a creature enters the battlefield. It doesn't have to be a creature on your side, it also triggers whenever an opponent puts out a creature. So that's going to happen with their creatures and with yours. Then you might have some permanents that only trigger when you put a creature out under your control. So when your opponent puts out a creature, this won't do anything. But if you put out a creature, you will draw a card. So keep an eye out for things your opponent might have that might trigger when you put cards out or when you play out your creatures. There's a difference between casting a spell and something entering the battlefield. So for example, with Gala Greeters, this will trigger, it has the alliance keyword, it will trigger whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control. And then you can choose one of these three options that hasn't been chosen before. You can put +1 counter on Gala Greeters, create a tapped treasure token, or gain 2 life. And you can only choose one of those that hasn't been chosen before, so you can't choose the +1 counter twice for 2 creatures, but you can get up to all 3 of those triggered abilities happening if you have 3 creatures enter the battlefield. But if your opponent counters a creature spell, that creature doesn't actually make it to the battlefield, so Gala Greeters won't trigger. But there are some cards that have abilities that will trigger when you cast the spell. So with Silverback Elder, if you cast a creature spell and your opponent counters that spell, you still cast the spell, so this trigger still happens. So you get to do any of those 3 options there. And it's interesting that compared to Gala Greeters, you have 3 options that you have to choose a different one each time it triggers on a turn. But with Silverback Elder, if you cast 3 creature spells, you could gain 4 life 3 times. Doesn't matter, you can choose it as many times as you want. So you want to read very carefully whether it happens when it triggers when you cast a creature spell or when a creature enters the battlefield. That's going to make a big difference to you. There are also some abilities that can trigger at instant speed and some that can only be triggered at sorcery speed, and it will tell you on the card how you can trigger that ability. So if we're having a look at Sunblessed Guardian, for 5 mana and a Phyrexian red, you can transform it into the Furnace Blessed Conqueror, but it says you can only do this, you can only activate it as a sorcery or at sorcery speed, so you can only do it at the main phase before combat or your main phase after combat. You can't do it on your opponent's turn, you can't do it in response to any other instant ability, which is a shame because it would be good if you could. But it's only sorcery speed and that's what it is. But if we have a look at Urg Spawn of Turg, it has this ability at the bottom where you can play a black and a green mana to sacrifice a land and you gain 2 life. But this does not say that you have to only do it at sorcery speed, so you can do it anytime you like. And in fact, you can do it any amount of times you like. If you have lots of land to sacrifice and enough mana to cast it, you could do it over and over again. So yes, you can do that at any time at all. So make sure if you can only do something at sorcery speed, you don't miss out and expect you can do it later on at instant speed and then just not get that ability. Keep an eye on that one. And then we have some abilities that will affect other creatures you control and some abilities that will include the creature that grants that ability. So for instance, with Takasha Digsite Mentor, it says that creatures you control have vigilance and can tap to surveil 1, which is put a card from the top of your library into the graveyard if you don't want that one. But this doesn't say other creatures, so this includes Takasha as well. So Takasha is a vigilance creature and can tap to surveil 1 anyway. But that will apply to all the creatures you have. And if we have a look at something like Sareth the Viper's Fang, this will give other tapped creatures you control Death Touch and other untapped creatures you control Hexproof. But that's other creatures. That means it doesn't include Sareth as well. So if you want Sareth to be Hexproof, you're going to have to do it some other way. And then we have some abilities that will trigger when this particular creature attacks or when any other creature attacks. So with Darling of the Masses, other citizens you control get +1/+0. As other citizens, not Darling of the Masses, it's still a 2/4. And when you attack with this creature, you create a 1/1 citizen creature token, which is technically a 2/1 when it comes out because you still have Darling of the Masses at the time. But this only triggers when Darling of the Masses attacks. If you attack with another creature, it doesn't trigger, it doesn't make that token. But with Adeline, it actually says whenever you attack. It doesn't say whenever you attack with Adeline or whenever Adeline attacks. So you could put Adeline out on turn 3 and attack with something you put out on turn 2, and it will still make that 1/1 human creature that's tapped and attacking. So cards like this might be much more useful because you don't have to attack with Adeline and risk losing it. You can just attack with anything else and you'll make that token still. And then there is a difference between hexproof and indestructible. So with Mondrak Glory Dominus, we can pay the ability at the bottom to put an indestructible counter on Mondrak. And we can do that at instant speed because it doesn't say that it's only at sorcery speed. Putting an indestructible counter on Mondrak doesn't mean it only gets indestructible until the end of turn. It means it keeps that. It's now an indestructible creature. But the only thing indestructible will prevent your opponent from doing is using murder type spells on it to destroy it, or hitting it with direct damage and causing it to die by taking that damage. But that won't prevent the opponent giving it something like -4/-4 to its power and toughness, and suddenly it's a 0/0 creature. It will die from that, even if it's not direct damage. That's one way of getting around the indestructible effect that some creatures might have. But indestructible is not the same as hexproof. It can still be targeted, like with the -4/-4. But if we have something like Skrelv Defector Might, it can tap and it can give another creature you control hexproof till end of turn. And hexproof means that your creature can't be the target of spells or abilities that your opponent controls, and in this case we have to choose a particular colour to make it hexproof from. So if your opponent is trying to put a -4/-4 on Mondrak, you can tap Skrelv and make Mondrak hexproof against black, for example. If they're casting a black spell, and suddenly that spell won't resolve and won't hit Mondrak. Hexproof is great for stopping your opponent targeting your creatures, but it won't stop other things from affecting it. So if it casts some spell like Depopulate that destroys all creatures, then it will still destroy something even if you put hexproof on it from Skrelv. Unless it's got indestructible, in which case even destroy all creatures won't make a difference. So if you have something that's hexproof and indestructible, it's pretty hard to kill unless the opponent has Farewell and suddenly they're exiling all of the creatures on the board. So that will even get it as well. So indestructible will prevent any direct damage or murder spells, but it won't prevent -X/-X abilities, and it won't stop it being exiled. Hexproof can stop it being targeted, but won't stop things that don't target. So like affecting all the creatures on the board is not targeting them. And then we have some abilities that will trigger at a certain time, and some that might be able to trigger lots of times on a turn. So Fairy Mastermind will allow you to draw a card whenever your opponent draws their second card each turn. So when they draw their first card, it doesn't do anything. When they draw their third card in a turn, or if they draw 7 cards, it's only going to trigger once when they draw their second one. But with Teferi Temporal Pilgrim, whenever you draw a card, you put a loyalty counter on Teferi. Well, if you draw 7 cards, you're putting 7 loyalty counters on it. It doesn't matter how many times it happens. If you can keep drawing cards, you can keep adding those counters on. So keep an eye on whether some things happen only at a certain time in a turn, and some things that can happen multiple times or at any time. Okay, so next we have creatures that do combat damage to the opponent and trigger in that way. So we have Deeproot Wayfinder, which is a March of the Machine card, that when it deals combat damage to a player or a battle, you can surveil 1, which is potentially putting a card from the top of your library into your graveyard. But this only triggers when Deeproot Wayfinder is the one doing the combat damage to the opponent. It doesn't help if you hit with anything else, it's not going to trigger this ability. But there are other cards like Grim Hireling that say whenever 1 or more creatures you control deal combat damage, you can create 2 treasure tokens. So here you don't have to attack with Grim Hireling, you can just attack with anything else. As long as it does combat damage to the opponent, you're going to make those treasure tokens. But if you attack with 5 creatures and they all do combat damage to the opponent, you're only making those 2 treasure tokens once, because it says whenever 1 or more creatures you control deal combat damage. But if you had something like Toski, it doesn't say 1 or more. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. If you hit your opponent with 5 creatures, you're going to be drawing 5 cards. So be very, very specific and have a look at whether it says 1 or more creatures. If it says whenever this creature does combat damage, that's going to make a difference to how your abilities trigger as well. And it's very important to have a look at the type of spell that you are casting. There's a really nice combination here from March of the Machine, where we have Phyrexian Censor, which says that each player can't cast more than 1 non-Phyrexian spell each turn, and non-Phyrexian creatures enter the battlefield tapped. So if you're just casting Phyrexian creatures, you can cast as many of them as you want, and they come out like normal. If your opponent is casting something that's not a Phyrexian, even if it has haste, it will come into the battlefield tapped, and it can't attack that turn, and it can't defend until their next turn when it untaps. So it's a great way of being able to disadvantage your opponent if they're not playing Phyrexian spells and you are. And what's really interesting with battles that came out in March of the Machine is that when you do damage to the battle and remove the defense counters, you can then cast the spell or cast the permanent Transformed. It doesn't cost anything to cast, so you might think, well, it's free, it's going to happen anyway. But if you've cast a spell on your turn already that's not a Phyrexian, and your opponent has a Phyrexian Censor, or in fact if you do, because it's effective for each player, then if you can remove the defense counters from this battle, you won't be able to cast the Transformed side because it's not a Phyrexian spell. I've had a few draft events where I've managed to trick my opponents into attacking their battles, trying to cast the other side of them, but I have a Phyrexian Censor out, and suddenly their battle that they've spent time attacking now goes to the graveyard or goes exiled because they couldn't cast it because they'd already cast another spell that turn. So pay attention to the type of spell you're casting because this can make a pretty big difference. And then we have creatures that sometimes will trigger when they die. So Infected Defector, when it dies, you get to incubate 3 and make an incubator token. But this only works when it dies. So if you are able to exile an Infected Defector, then the death trigger won't happen. It will just go to exile zone and it won't make the incubator token. But there are some cards that trigger actually when they leave the battlefield rather than when they die. So if your opponent has a Circuit Mender out, whether you exile it, you bounce it back to their hand, or you murder it, either way it's left the battlefield and they will still draw a card. The last thing you want to do is bounce a Circuit Mender, let your opponent draw a card and they play it out again, gain some more life, and potentially draw another card when you try to deal with it again. So there's not much you can do if your opponent has this out. If you want to get rid of it, they're going to draw the card. But if your opponent has something that triggers when it dies, if you are able to exile it, be able to get around that trigger happening. And then it's important to have a look at whether creatures are tokens or non-tokens, because some abilities will make a difference as to whether you can target them or not. So with Shield Red, the new one from March of the Machine, when it enters the battlefield, your opponent needs to sacrifice a non-token creature or planeswalker. But if they manage to have only token creatures, or if they have a token planeswalker that they've copied from somewhere, then they won't have to sacrifice anything because they don't have any non-tokens. But if they have lots of tokens and maybe one really good creature that's not a token, it will mean they'll have to sacrifice that one. So pay attention to whether a creature is a token or a non-token, because that's going to make a difference to what you can do to it. Tokens are normally generated from other permanents or copies of permanents that someone controls. But we have things like Shield Red's Edict, which is a really versatile card, and you see quite a lot these days, because you can cause your opponent to sacrifice specifically a non-token creature or a token one. There might be some instances when your opponent has lots of tokens and then one non-token creature and you'd rather get rid of that one. Or you might have an opponent that has lots of normal creatures and then one token creature that's really strong or really difficult to deal with, and you can make them specifically sacrifice that one. So pay attention to whether something's a token or a non-token, because that's going to make a big difference to you as well. And then we have our final example here, which is the legend rule. So if we have a Shield Red out on the battlefield, which is a legendary creature, and we want to use something like Mirror Hall Mimic or any other spell or ability that will enter as a copy of a creature on the battlefield, this will enter as a copy of Shield Red and it will be a legendary creature. And because of the legend rule, which means you'll have to sacrifice one of those two legends, you can't have two of the same legends out, then casting Mirror Hall Mimic on a shield red is not going to do anything for you because you're just going to, well, it'll make the opponent sacrifice a non-token creature or planeswalker, but then you'll have to make one go to the graveyard. But there are also some abilities like with Vesuvan Duplimancy where you can create a token copy of a creature or an artifact, except it's not legendary. So with this, if we were casting spells on Shieldred, we could make token copies of Shieldred that are not legendary, and then you can have multiple Shieldreds on the board and your opponent will probably just scoop. You can also get around the legendary rule with something like Mirror Box that just specifically says the legend rule doesn't apply to permanents you control. So you could just cast, as if you had 4 Shieldreds in your hand, you could cast all of them. It doesn't matter that they're legendary. Unless your opponent can destroy the Mirror Box, and then you'd have to sacrifice the other Shieldreds you have out and just keep one of them out as well. So these things make a difference, whether it's legendary or non-legendary. Some things like Reflection of Kiki-Jiki can copy non-legendary creatures you control, so you won't be able to copy a Shieldred, but you can copy something that's non-legendary. So if you had some crazy combination where you have a Shieldred and you have Vesuvan Duplimancy, and you make a copy of Shieldred that's now not legendary, then if you put out Fable of the Mirror Breaker and have Reflection of Kiki-Jiki, you could copy your non-legendary Shieldred and make an extra one of those and attack with it, which is some crazy deck that no one would ever make. But if it does happen to come up in any particular deck that you're using or in any match, then it's important that you know the difference between having legendary creatures and non-legendary and how that legend rule applies to you. So I hope that's helpful to you to make sure you are reading the card and noticing the difference between how these rules are specifically written on the card. There are many times when I've made this mistake, and lots of other people do too, where they don't read a card, they don't know if something can happen at instant or sorcery speed, if it's difference between hexproof and indestructible. Some people try to make something indestructible when you're exiling it. All these different things are mistakes that you can avoid if you just read the card properly. Let me know in the comments below if there's any other specific card rules that you can think of that maybe I haven't covered here that people tend to get wrong. Be interesting to see what other rules come up. And don't forget, you can like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future content. And thanks for watching this video to the end. I will see you in the next one.